Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Chris Legaspi, and today we are going to continue the Lessons from the Masters series. And in this episode, we are going to explore composition skills. Part of what makes these artists great and reason why we admire them is their ability to create beautiful pictures that aren't just technically good drawings and paintings, but also create emotions, tell stories, and just overall inspire us and attract us. And that is done through composition. So we're going to look at three great masters from history, and we're going to try to learn some composition skills from looking at their work. So we're going to begin by a brief overview of the skills that we're going to learn today, or we're going to explore, and then we're going to do some demonstrations and studies and analyze the work of these great masters. We're going to start with tonal design with Rembrandt, shape design with Edgar Payne, and story and emotion with Howard Pyle. And before we begin, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my free insiders email list where you'll get access to live classes like this, along with other free lessons, free videos, free content. You also get discounts on courses, programs. You get first access to upcoming premium classes, other private live streams like this. So all you have to do is go to www.drawwithchris.com, and there you can enter your email and you'll be a part of the insiders email list. You can also go to downloads and see some of the free content and lessons available. I have figure drawing, head drawing, color. You can even access the private Discord community. So go to drawwithchris.com and there you can enter your email and you'll be all set. You'll be good to go. And before we begin, comment below, where are you located? Where are you watching from? What time is it for you? I am currently in Thailand. It's Saturday morning for me, so welcome wherever you are. Today we're going to explore composition skills, and the three specific skills that we're going to look at are number one, tonal design, shape design, and story and emotion. We're going to begin by looking at tonal design of arguably one of the greatest artists who have ever lived, arguably the greatest of all time, and for sure one of the greatest overall artists in terms of skill, technique, craftsmanship, the great Rembrandt. And he is one of the first to really emphasize a form of composition that is structured around simplified values. So tonal composition and tonal design, that's one of the ways that makes Rembrandt's work stand out so much, is his beautiful and simple tonal design. So we're going to look at tonal design in terms of limited values and also controlling contrast, and also how he uses it to create story and narrative. And here, this is one of his most famous paintings, the Anatomy Lesson. And you can see the beautiful and powerful and eye-catching use of value. Of course, the contrast of this bright, 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 bright figure with the bright, bright, bright fabric is almost pure white against basically a dark, dark, dark room surrounded by figures wearing black clothing. So it's basically a beautiful light thing in a dark, dark, dark world, a dark composition. So it immediately stands out in terms of contrast and value. And of course, lots of storytelling can be told here. A dark room tells a certain story, creates different emotion. A character that's brightly lit conveys certain emotions and story. This piece is just one of many great examples from Rembrandt, so we'll look at him in detail. The next skill we're going to look at is shape design. Shape, in my mind, is one of the first considerations. Shape and value are one of the first considerations when you make a picture, because your picture itself is basically a rectangle or a square. So you have to understand that because of your limitation, you only have this little rectangle to work with. You have to first divide it into shapes that serve the picture that you're trying to make. So by nature, every 2D artist, any artist working on paper or canvas on any flat two-dimensional surface must consider the arrangement of shapes. And of course, that is the core of composition. And for that, we're going to look at the great Edgar Payne. Now, some of the things that Edgar Payne demonstrates and some of the things we're going to look at are number one, simple geometry, value design and contrast, and also shape contrast. So simple geometry is obviously things like rectangles, circles, and triangles, the most basic things. And every great landscape painter, Edgar Payne was mostly known for landscapes, must be a master of designing rectangles, obviously, and triangles, because mountains, the sky, the earth, and mountains are generally are basically rectangles and triangles. So you have to, at the very least, be very competent with those simple shapes. And of course, here you can see an example of Edgar Payne skillfully using the third shape, which is the arc, the circle, the oval. So beautiful. Also, little circles here in the clouds as well. And that leads to shape contrast. So, of course, specifically in landscapes, of course, we need the two rectangles of sky and earth. Okay. But we can't, you can also play around with other shapes. You can see here, this is a great example of that. The dominant, in this particular painting by Edgar Payne, the dominant shape is this big arc, this big rock cave thing that's basically a simplified arc shape, a circle. And then he gives you the ground plane, the bottom rectangle, which is, in this case, it's water. And then he kind of spices it up. It gives you some variety and contrast with this big triangle here in the foreground and little smaller circles, these little puffy circular clouds, which most likely were not an accident that he painted them in this shape. So that's an example of shape contrast and value contrast, kind of like what we saw with the Rembrandt before. You can see beautiful darks here in the foreground, the lights in the background really make the painting pop, the value contrast of dark and light, and then everything else in between just complements the full value range. So we'll look at that. And the last composition skill we're going to look at is a bit of a subjective skill, meaning it's not quite something that you can clearly define, like triangle, circle, square, black and white. And that is story and emotional impact. So this is what I refer to as psychology, because pictures have an effect on your psychology. Whenever you look at a picture, or especially a good picture, a well-crafted picture, you will feel something, you will notice something. Something will come up in your memories, in your thoughts, in your emotions. That is the goal of every artist, really, is to create some kind of emotional impact. And one of the greats in history that is a master and a genius at this is the great Howard Pyle. Howard Pyle is an American illustrator, and here's one of his pieces, and we're going to look at one of his works. And you could just see in this picture alone, this is a very famous painting in history, and you can see in this painting alone, lots of feeling, lots of emotion is conveyed. Some of the ways that Howard Pyle uses or creates more story and emotion, and we're going to look at today, are things like value design, placement of things and objects and elements, and poses and expression, of course. As you can see here, you can clearly see, because there's a human figure, the pose, this is like an actor now. The pose communicates an emotion, and then combined with the other elements of placement and value, really amplifies the emotion communicated by this pose. Our first composition skill is tonal design, and we're going to look at one of the great masters, the great Rembrandt, and this is one of his beautiful works. Now, Rembrandt was what's known as a tonalist painter. He was an indoor painter for the most part. Tonalist painters are painters who paint dominantly with value and subdued colors, as you can see in this example. And most of Rembrandt's examples, the colors aren't quite super vibrant, like, for example, like a Monet, like a Mucha. or a Degas, no real bright colors, just very muted, lots of grays, lots of browns. Because of that, it allows him to really amplify the effect of the value. So he's great to study for value. And you can see here the first thing that I notice is the beautiful simplicity of the values. So here in Photoshop, I just turned down the color quite a bit so you can see more of the tones. And look at the beautiful blacks. To me, the first thing I notice is the beautiful, beautiful blacks. Of course, because of the face, we gravitate towards the face. And you can see the face, the human face, is surrounded by black, 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 very dark. In fact, the darkest dark is right around her face. And you can see how the black of her face connects or groups with the black of her, or this, it's a table, I believe, or her lap. It's a table, the bottom of the book, and even part of the background. So that is called value grouping. And that is the first of our value palette or value shapes is the dark. Next, let's look at for the light. What is the brightest thing here? Comment below. What is the brightest thing? Of course, it's the book. The book, the book, the book. The book is quite bright. And then, of course, everything in between, which is basically the wall. The wall is a nice example of midtone, especially right here. You can see the beautiful use of midtone and how this is not quite as bright as the book, and it's definitely not as dark as the dark dark. And you could see the beautiful contrast between this shape and this shape of her hat, of her headdress, against the wall, the mid-tone gray of the wall, and you can see the contrast. So that means there are two distinct values, and that's also part of what makes Rembrandt great and what makes good tonal composition is the intelligent use of value contrast. So you can see how this really simplifies into basically a three value painting, a dark, a midtone, and a light. And it's clearly all of that can be seen if you just look at the wall at the top, the wall here, and then the book. All of that. That's basically the value palette that Rembrandt uses, and that's why the tonal composition is so successful, is because the values are grouped, and they're grouped in a way that also communicates the things you want to communicate in the story: figure, background, and object in this case. Now I'm going to analyze the value now, do a little tonal study, and you can follow along with me. First thing I'm going to do is match the aspect ratio as best as I can. I don't always succeed. Now what I'm going to do is try to match the shape of the drawing. So this particular study is only the composition, so I'm not going to, try to add all the beautiful details in the face, try to get the perfect texture on the wall or anything like that. I just want the shapes as close to the original as possible so I can assign them their tones, their value. And we could see how, and then we could learn how Rembrandt did that, how he designed the values in this particular painting, and we can then use that in our own work. So I'm running out of space here, so I have to deal with the face. I can deal with the face, and I got to be careful not to get seduced by the detail. There's lots of beautiful detail in her face, obviously. Masterful, masterful draftsmanship. Comment below if any of you have ever seen a Rembrandt in person. Comment below. Admittedly, the first time I saw a Rembrandt, I was quite late in life. I was in my 30s. And I saw my first Rembrandt in person in San Diego, which is in the US, on the west coast of the US. It was his Apostles series, Rembrandt's Apostles, the 12 Apostles, who were the men who accompanied Jesus Christ in the Christian tradition there. And he did these beautiful portraits. They're almost life size. I think they were about, well, slightly bigger than life size. They were quite large, and they were the most absolutely incredible when you can see the craftsmanship. When you look and you can see his brushstrokes and the draftsmanship and the quality of his marks, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable the just the level of skill and craftsmanship. So that is quite impressive. But for me, the thing that really moved me was the emotion, and I quite can't quite explain it. But full disclosure, I almost wept. I literally almost cried when I saw the Rembrandt, and they were in a room, and they were like all in a room, and they were all presented well and lit well, and just being in this room full of these portraits done one of the greatest, arguably the greatest artists who ever lived. And then when you see them in person in the room, all displayed together, it was so moving. I almost cried because it was such. I Yeah, I can't explain it. Even to this day, I can't explain really why it was so moving to me. But I know part of it was the lighting, the way he lights these things. And this painting here, the woman reading, the lighting's exactly the same, and which is from above, and that is adds a lot of story to your painting. Specifically, if what you're describing is something religious. Rembrandt was a religious man, and he was a very religious man, and he the light, the way he lit his paintings was symbolism for the light of God, the light from above, light from heaven. That's why a lot of his paintings have a dominantly overhead lighting scheme. There's sort of this glowy, ethereal kind of glow to his lights, and that is partly, of course, it's good for the work of art, but story wise and emotional, psychologically, it is part of his strategy. Okay, let me add some tones now. I spent way too much time on the drawing. All right, now I'm going to block in the dark, 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 dark. This might not be dark enough. I just take a nice dark, and what I'll do is I'll first block in the darks that I see and that are obvious. We like to do that. I like to start with the obvious. The obvious dark is dark, and the obvious light is light. And with some painters, it's easier and more obvious than others. And tonalists like Rembrandt make it easy for us to see because he wanted you to see his simplified values. But his face is way too detailed. I carried away. Really enjoy doing these. I need to do them more often. Now she has some shapes in her face. I'm going to group them with the darks, and that is exactly what Rembrandt would have intended, and that is part of good tonal composition is to group as much as you can. So that includes the darks in the face. Try to stay nice and dark, especially in the shadow here. They stay nice and dark, and then if they stay nice and dark, they will group with the darks that you have established. There's a bit of dark halftone under her chin. I'm not 100% sure how to handle that, but just go ahead and group it. Little shapes in her mouth and glasses and the eyelashes. You can see how, in her dress, side of this book right here, for example, lots of subtle, variation in the dark. But for the sake of the study, I'm just going to group as much as possible. And there's one more dark that I forgot. Do you see it? Do you see? Comment below. Do you see which dark I forgot? Of course, it's the background. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to add a gradient, and I'm using Photoshop, so it's easy to do that with a gradient. And you see, a gradient is a transition from one value to another, or one color to another. You can see up here, dark, 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 right? The wall, this is the wall, basically groups with the dark of her fabric and shadow. So it's all one dark mass. And then you can see the wall, right? It gets lighter at the book, and it gets a little bit darker at the bottom, more towards a halftone. So that is a gradation. That is exactly what we want. Of course, you can do that in many ways, many ways to do gradation. Here, specifically, just because I'm using Photoshop, it's a it's a simple way. They have a very powerful gradation tool. It's very simple to use. Okay, next I'm going to drop in the lightest light, which is the book. And once I have this, then I'll be able to gauge the middle values, whatever's in between, and that will kind of give me the complete picture. Where else? A couple little specks of highlight on her dress, but that really is about it. This picture is quite moody. There's a bit of a glow in the background, so maybe I'll address that now with the gradient tool right here. Let's see what that looks like. So I wanted to add that kind of glowy feel, and this looks great. So what I did was I used just a simple gradient. It's basically a blurry, soft, airbrushy thing. You can do this many different tools. You can see really complements the gradient, and it creates that kind of glowy effect that we see in the original. And I think that's exactly what Rembrandt would have intended. Now, the last thing I want to consider are the lights in her face. Her face is mid-tone, but there are lots of lights in her face. The question is, are the lights in her face as bright as the book? Meaning, do we group the lights in her face with the lights in the book, or do we group the lights in her face with halftone? Comment below. What would you do? What do you see? It is tricky. It is tricky, but I would argue the lights in her face are a midtone. Same as sort of this book here. They're a light midtone. So what that means is it's a gradient of the light. And I'll show you how we do that. What I'm going to do is apply the light as a gradient. And this is something that really powerful way to keep your values nice and grouped and still get a little bit more variation, more flexibility, more because the more values that you add, The one advantage to it is that it gives you more ability to show form. But of course, the disadvantage of that is you lose the graphic design punch. I would argue is more important, or in most cases, more important. Not every case. See, what I'm doing is I'm not assigning a new value. I'm just applying my light value as a gradient. So in traditional, it's basically using the side of your pencil, essentially, or a softer brush. Basically, taking your white paint and using a softer brush to make a softer mark, or thinning your paint, or I don't recommend that, but in pencil or charcoal or pastel, a dry medium, you could just take your same white stick, white tool, and then smudge it or blend it to create sort of the blendy effect, which is basically a gradient. And that's really about it. There's also dark gradients too. Let's do that now, real quick. Okay, the final thing is just the dark gradients. Now it really starts to feel like form, but I'm not doing form. I'm just applying the same value. Really, it's still a value shape that I'm using, but with a different application, really applying it as a gradient. And by gradient, I mean this. That's what I mean. Still a grouped value to create the illusion of more sophisticated values, but really, in reality, we're still very, very grouped and simple and graphic. That strong punch. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. I think the contrast reads well, the simplified values and value groups read well, and also the emotional and story impact that this glowy light has in this dark world, sort of like what we saw earlier with his anatomy lesson, famous anatomy lesson painting. A glowy, soft, bright light in a dark, dark world, in this case, communicates a bit of a spiritual or religious context, because I believe the title of this painting is Woman Reading a Bible, I believe. I could be wrong. Either way, because of the artist's intent, he used a value, specifically light, in this way to communicate that particular story or narrative. Next composition skill is shape design. Really, composition is the art of arranging shapes because we are limited by a rectangle, basically. So we have to find ways to manipulate this rectangle into an interesting picture, a picture that tells a story that creates emotional impact. And one of the ways we do that is by arranging, by first considering the big graphic or geometric arrangement of very simple shapes. And what are the simple shapes? They are, of course, squares and rectangles, triangles, and circles, ovals, and things like that, arcs. That's really all we have to work with. And of course, every landscape painter, like I mentioned, knows that you must be a master of, at the very least, rectangles and triangles to be successful in landscape. Look at this gorgeous and very simple and very graphic landscape painting by Edgar Payne. You can see how it's essentially a triangle. Now, isn't that amazing how this skilled artist basically painted a giant green triangle on a canvas and he tricked everyone into believing it's a landscape, right? When I look at this, I see green triangle, green abstract shape, green arcing thing, green rectangle. I see this kind of abstract polygonal thing. I see an arcing shape. I see this kind of polygonal thing. I see a dominantly a arrangement of green rectangles with some archy shapes for some spice and variety, and also some more of these abstract things in the background. But that is the lesson, is that if you can arrange these very simple things, squares, rectangles, and circles, in an intelligent way, you can create a picture. You can trick people into thinking it's, I mean, it's an illusion. I don't, I don't mean to sound crude, but when I say trick, I mean illusion. Realist art, representational art is 100% an illusion. It's not real. It's a flat thing. So we have to work within our limitations, and shape design is the first building block, in my opinion. And of course, value too. We have to consider the value. Now, obviously, we wouldn't even see this triangle if it wasn't a different value than the sky. So right away, his triangle design has to have some value contrast to separate it from this top shape. In this case, it's representative of the sky. So the sky is bright, and we know if you make a rectangle at the top of a canvas and make it blue, 99 out of 100 million, 99.99% of people will look at that and instantly think, oh, that's the sky. It's just, it's ingrained in our DNA. So just the fact that you paint a blue rectangle at the top of your painting already communicates massive details to the viewer. And then you put in a triangle in front of a bright blue sky. What do you get? You instantly, the viewer will instantly draw or paint landscape for you. The viewer will do the work for you if you set the table and create the opportunity for the viewer to fill in your picture. And of course, when you get engagement, that's what we want. That is, in my opinion, the first goal of composition is to engage the viewer, to get their attention. And then this is one great way to do that with very big, bold graphic shape and very simple, and strong value contrast. This mountain, especially the shadow, this little big long cast shadow, is quite dark relative to the sky. So you can see these two areas, they really pop out. They really contrast against each other, which creates some beautiful attention grabbing part of the painting right there. So let's examine this painting here some more. So Edgar Payne, for me, has quite, I talk about him quite a bit. I probably, out of every 10 videos I make, I talk about him in at least two of them. He seems to just come up constantly. I just, I can't stop looking at his work. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. In my opinion, it's absolutely genius landscape, genius composition. And I did the majority of my art training in California. His work is all, it's all over California. He did a lot of paintings in the western part of the United States where California is in. So he's quite admired by California galleries and collectors. And, in a lot of ways, he sort of represents the art, I don't want to say style, but the philosophy of that region of America. California has a rich history of colorful outdoor paintings with very beautiful, bold graphic design. And Edgar Payne is a star example of that, in my opinion. One of the star examples of that. So I'm going to match the canvas here, aspect ratio as best I can. Now I'm going to match his drawing. I saw many Edgar Paynes in person. Comment below if you have ever seen an Edgar Payne in person. I saw many in person, and they're so cool. They vary in size. Some are quite large, um, some are average size. Interesting about them is the wonderful brush application. He paints in very, it looks like a flat brush or a filbert, but flat. His paint strokes look like that. They're very flat, like tiles. So let's see. Now I'm going to try to match the shape of I got the primary shape, which is a big old rectangle. Let's pause here. This is a good point. So I have a drawing. I basically have a very simple and crude drawing based off Edgar Payne. But if we look at my drawing so far at the right, what do you see? Comment below. What do you see? Or here's a better question. If we showed this drawing to lay people meaning people who aren't artists, who aren't collectors, who aren't art admirers, just average people who don't really think about art that much, if we showed this little drawing to them, what would they say it is? Of course, they would say it's a landscape. But isn't that remarkable? Isn't that remarkable? This is shape design. This is why it's so fascinating to me. It's so fascinating how this is inside of a human being. The reason why you don't why you see mountain landscape isn't because I drew a mountain or landscape or we're looking at it's because your genetic DNA encoding memory tells you, hey, that's probably a landscape. That's probably a mountain in the distance. Isn't that incredible? So that is, to me, what makes composition so fun and important is because you really can, I don't want to say trick, but you can really manipulate your audience in such powerful ways with very little things, right? I just drew one, two, three, four lines, and you will draw a landscape for me. Isn't that incredible? I just love it. This is why I love composition so much. And now that I add some of these details, watch this. The moment I do this, watch. The moment I do this, I'm gonna, if I did this, right? If I show this little scribble right here to lay people, people who aren't artists, what would they say this is? They'll say, oh yeah, it's probably a tree. It's an ugly tree. It's probably a tree. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? That a scribble on a piece of paper can have some kind of impact on a human being. That is unbelievable to me. Oh, I just love it. I just love it. So that's why I think about composition so much because it's such a to me it's like a powerful weapon. You can you can you can use it to really affect your viewer and amplify your picture. That's why we remember all the greats in history because probably you're watching this, you're into realism, you love technique, draftsmanship, rendering, edges, and all those beautiful things. But part of the reason why we remember the Rembrandts, the Zorns, the Wyatts, the Sargents is because not only did they have excellent technical skills in draftsmanship, but they could compose and manipulate your emotions as well. So it's just a super powerful combination. Okay, my drawing is a little off, but let's see if I can improve it. It's a little off, but really you can see I almost don't even need to add the tone, right? In this kind of blobby, sketchy form, it kind of feels like a mountain with looks like rocks. They don't look like trees to me, but we'll try to sort that out. But isn't that amazing? Just a bunch of couple little scribbles can communicate a picture. Okay, let's see. Let's add some tone here. I'm going to start with the darkest dark that I see, and I'm going to try to simplify them. Now, this cast shadow has lots of nuances, lots of variations of dark, quite all the same dark, obviously, but it is close enough to be grouped. So remember what we learned from Rembrandt is to value grouping to get that to help us get that emotional impact Value grouping does that. Okay, so I got that. Let me try to make my ugly tree not so ugly. And I'm thinking I should go darker. It's just not. And as I do this, I want to make sure that, particularly in this foreground, that the shadow shapes sort of kind of communicate a tree. Drawing wise, they look like rocks a little bit, but that's because I use a lot of geometric straights. I use a lot of straights. So although I'm not going into detail, I do want shape. So I have a good value, but now I got to make sure that when I draw that value, that I draw a good shape that communicates something. In this case, I want it to communicate the shadow side of a tree in light. And you don't need much. You just need to have the right shape at the correct value and correct location, and the viewer will draw a tree for you. So that is what we want. And when the viewer draws a tree for us, the viewer draws the mountain, viewer draws the landscape, the viewer is engaged. And when they're engaged, you got them. You have won, in my opinion. Well, you've won first half of the battle. There's two parts to composition. Is The first part is to get the attention and the engagement. The second part is to keep their attention, so to keep them looking at your painting instead of looking away at the next painting or looking at their phone or looking at other distractions. Attention and keep the attention. That's our goal. Better I design these shapes just like Edgar Payne did and try to copy his design actually, the more they will, more the viewer will think that they are trees. So I have to do a good job here. Can't be too sloppy, it can't just be too random. I have to consider, okay, these are forms and there's light on these forms, so I will need to make sure that shadow shape reads well, just like when we draw figure or face, when we put the shadow on a figure or face, we got to get those shadow shapes to look like an eye or a hand or whatever. All right, so I got that there. It's my darkest dark. Of course, there's some more darks up here in variation, but I'm just going to keep that grouped for now. And then I'm going to block in let me get the dark of this hillside here. Okay, I just dropped in a dark mass, so it's sort of a dark halftone to kind of represent the this field here, this hillside. What I really want is I need the shape so I can start to address the clouds because the clouds are the brightest thing. So I want to make sure I get that in there before I move on. So I got this. Now there's clearly a gradient. You see how it's darker on the sides and then brighter in the middle. You see that? So it's basically a circular gradient. It's almost got that what we saw with Rembrandt, that heavenly glowy kind of light right here. Okay, I'm going to drop in the lightest light just so I can see it and then I can compare. So right now, right away, the sky looked pretty good. There's a bit of a gradient in the sky, so I need to address that. But shape-wise, it's pretty simple. Just kind of make these blobby kind of shapes that, because clouds are so abstract. There's really no Clouds can be anything, obviously. So as long as they kind of are white, they're bright and they're kind of blobby looking things in a blue sky, then the viewer will know what it is. So now it's up to, for this particular painting, to control their value. If we got the shape, so they do read like clouds. Now we got to control their value so it kind of completes the picture. Here I just put a little gradient over that area so it kind of matches the gradient in the sky, and put it over the cloud here. And the last thing I'm going to do before I move on is just going to put the glowiness. I'm going to put the gradient in the ground. And I think what I will do is put some dark first and then evaluate. This gradation is important for many reasons. But for me, what I want is I want to make this middle shape stand out. This middle shape right here is a big part of this design. It's a little bit here. It's basically a shape of light. So I want to get that in there. And I'm going to use the gradient tool first. Here I'm just going to take the light of cloud, a little too bright in my opinion. So I'm going to turn it down. And I'm going to make sure that this dark bushy shape gets called out, and then these dark shapes right here get called out. So now you can see it's a bit more contrast. And you can see that I do need to go darker. Value-wise, I do need to go a little bit darker, surrounding this light side of the mountain. But I think shape-wise, I'm going to move on here. Clearly, this was the reason why I chose this painting in particular, because it's so abstract. It's basically, like I said, it's basically a triangle. It's basically one big old triangle. So the lesson here is that, can you make a picture with basically very few abstract geometric shapes? And clearly, Edgar Payne accomplished that. So now we can learn that from him. Telling stories and creating emotional impact. And they are related in a way, because if your story or the theme or whatever you're trying to communicate is an emotion, then that's, of course, then that's part of what your composition has to accomplish. And we're going to look at Howard Pyle. Howard Pyle was one of the fathers of American illustration, and particularly the what's called the Golden Age. He taught many, 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 many greats of American illustration. One of his top students was the great Dean Cornwell, and you can see the resemblance in their work. And Pyle was not as famous as Cornwell, but one thing he is famous for is Pyle's pirates. He painted a series of book covers and illustrations and things of pirates, and they are so memorable in history. In fact, you could argue that the reason why pirates in modern day, modern current times entertainment, current times art and things look the way they do is because of Howard Pyle. Besides being a brilliant character designer, he was an absolute genius with composition, absolute genius. The more I look at Pyle, the more I can't stop looking at Pyle. I learn something new every time, and every time I look at his work, I'm just reminded, like, oh, okay, I really I need to move my composition more towards this man, or do more of what he was doing, because he's absolutely brilliant. And one of many things that he accomplished is incredible emotional impact. Like we saw earlier, that famous painting of his in the beginning. Here's another example we're going to look at of one of his pirates. Let me talk about some of the tools he's using. Now, this is important. So there are many, many ways to tell a story with composition, and I'm going to try to share a few ideas. Number one, and the most obvious, is if you're going to have figures, obviously, and faces, their poses and emotion, their poses and facial expression, of course, right? They communicate emotion because we're human beings, and also because we relate to them, and also their design of their poses. So if you can see, based on these poses, you can tell, you can infer, or you, the viewer, will create a story just based on their poses. Comment below. What is the relationship between these two men and this man standing here? What is their relationship? Or in other words, who is the dominant figure? Who is the subordinate figure or figures? Of course, you know this figure is the dominant figure based on their pose. Why? Why? Because his pose is absolutely erect and upright. Erect means upright. Look how tall he is standing, straight up, tall and proud. Look at the hand on his hip. That's the boss. That's the boss pose. BOSS. When your boss is mad at you, when your boss wants to command your attention, when when you're a kid and your parents are mad at you, that is the pose of authority. So upright with the arm, and he's holding a sword. He's got a sword. He's got a sword. It's not quite in the pose, but that definitely helps. He's got a sword. They got a shovel. So I would rather have the sword. It's much more threatening. So upright, and look at their poses. Look at their poses. Curved, bent over, head over the knees, head over the feet. That is a form of submission. This is a pose. It's essentially, he's digging, yes, but he's also, when you bow, you take this exact same pose. You lower your head to someone, you are bowing, you are in submission to someone. For that moment, that person you are bowing to is above you, is dominant, is the dominant figure. So based on this pose alone, he is telling a story. You could take out you could take out the pirate gear, you could take out the sword, you can take out the treasure chest, you can take out the background and draw them in isolation, and you will see that, oh, okay, clearly this figure is dominating these two figures in some way. That is storytelling. Okay, what else? What else does Pyle do to communicate the relationship or story between these three characters? What else? Do you see it? Do you see it? How do we know the story of these three characters based on this composition? One is the pose, and the other is the placement. Placement. If we divide this canvas, who is at the top? Check. Who is at the bottom? No, right? So when you're at the top, psychologically, when you're at above, pictorially, this is a picture. When you're above, when something is above something, it is generally assumed to be the dominant thing. And that, again, that is embedded, encoded in your DNA. When you see a picture, the thing at the top of the picture, you assume it's more important or at least more dominant than the thing below it. And look at also where he placed his figure. He is literally almost stepping on the guy. Do you see that? You see, it's obviously there's no foot because they're not in the same plane of space. But the foot, he's almost like literally stomping on the guy, pressing him down. So again, that's another way to communicate the story between these three things is the placement. So placement is super important. And these guys are placed really low. They're pretty low. They're well below the horizon line. They're well below the halfway mark. They're well below the horizon line. So they're low. So things low on the canvas feel heavy. And another emotional connotation for things that are heavy is sadness, somberness, right? We think of happy things as being light, like birds, wind, music. Music is light and ethereal. The sun, we all love, human beings love the sun, clouds. So we associate positive emotions with things at the top and more heavy emotions with things at the bottom. So these guys are heavier because they're at the bottom and they're also in the corner. They are also very close to the corner. And when you're in the corner, it's a very uncomfortable position. So when you have a thing, an erect, upright figure above two figures that are essentially bowing, you put them at the bottom in the corner and you put his foot on his back, boom, you have just told basically you have just told the story. And all you did was arrange three figures in an intelligent way. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. This is masterful. You see, I just learned something new. Like I said, every time I look at Pyle, I learn something new. I just learned that he put his boot there. That is not an accident. I'm going to do that. You see, every time I do a master copy, I do them because I want to steal from great artists. And now I'm going to steal this. I'm going to make a drawing or a composition. And I'm going to put a boot on someone's back just for fun. It's going to be hilarious and cool. That is so cool. What else story wise? Okay. Does the values tell a story? Comment below. How do you feel when you see a painting that's dominantly gray? How do you feel when you look at a big field of gray? How do you feel when the sky is gray? How does gray dominance make you feel? Of course, it makes you feel very, very somber. You're somber meaning you're not quite sad, but you're like not happy either. You know, I wish the day was brighter. I wish the sun was out. I wish I could enjoy a beautiful sunny day because psychologically we all love beautiful sunny days. So gray, his use of gray is an intentional storytelling element. And notice there's not much contrast. Yes, there is contrast, but there's not like super dynamic pops like we saw in the Rembrandt, right? The sky is quite gray and muted. The ground, even though it's sand, it's quite gray and muted. And even though there's lots of darks in the figure and the pirate, they don't pop that much against the background. They don't pop that much against the background because the background is mostly gray. And that is on purpose to get you to feel this like heavy, somber moment. So let's look at Pyle. I could talk about Howard Pyle all day. Let's do a little study here. Okay, I'm gonna try my best to match the shapes on this drawing. It's a bit complex and it's also a bit precise, meaning I have to be fairly accurate of the placement. The placement is, like we just discussed, is incredibly important. It's a big part of this painting, of this composition, is the where these characters are, where they are placed in the frame, in the canvas. So I have to honor that and get as close as I can to their shape and then their placement. So it's a bit precise, and I have to be very careful and probably have to do a lot of erasing or moving things around, which I already know. Already right here I have to do. When I first started studying composition, it was Steve Huston who was my first like major influence. He said, "Hey, do a bunch of tonal compositions, and you'll get really good." And I said, "Okay, I believe you, Steve." And he was right. And one of the first artists that I obsessively studied was Dean Cornwell. I obsessed over Dean Cornwell. I thought he was just so just so fun to look at. I couldn't stop looking at his paintings, so I was happy to do them. And then later, I discovered that Cornwell, you know, was a heavily. He was arguably Pyle's number one student, most successful student. He was heavily influenced by Pyle. And then when I started looking at Pyle, I saw where Dean Cornwell got his game from. Every artist that we admire typically has other artists that came before that they learned from. When I discovered that um, Cornwell, I don't want to say copy, that's not the right word, but is heavily influenced. uh, I immediately started to to look at Pyle and appreciate Pyle even more because he basically was he basically was the mentor of one of my favorite artists, Dean Cornwell, and this deservedly so. I mean, there's a reason why Dean Cornwell, and not just Dean. I mean, he was widely respected when he was alive, considered a genius. Considered a genius in both making the art and teaching. Is also one of his great gifts was teaching. Okay, and then this last figure. This is kind of tough. If you're following along and you're new to figure drawing, try your best. I'm making mine a little bit too detailed, I think. So it's probably better to keep it really abstract, like sort of like this guy right here, this figure, a bit more abstract, because that's really the most important thing for this study. We're not going to do a complete study. So let's see. I think canvas wise, I need to change a little bit. Okay, I adjusted the canvas a little bit, and I'm gonna lock in the background shapes now. So if I draw the horizon, he's too short. Gotta make my pirate taller. I drew him like me, made him too short. I gotta make him taller. Okay. Okay, so I adjusted the pirate. Now I'm gonna block in the darks. Wow, this is so much. The more I look at this thing, I just keep. I It's so compelling. Wonderful. That's the power of composition and good storytelling, good craftsmanship. I keep it's almost like I'm this as I stare at this painting or this drawing, this illustration. I'm seeing a movie in my mind. I'm imagining the wind blowing. I'm imagining the ship they came on. I'm imagining the other crew members. I'm imagining the sound and the birds and the imagining what he's yelling at them, or if he's yelling at all, what they're talking about. Really coming to life for me the more I look at it, and that is a testament to Pyle's skill, and that is something that we want in our work. Everyone watching this, you all want the same thing. You want your viewer to be so engaged to your painting that they never leave. And then if they do leave, they'll think about your painting or your drawing after they leave. That is wonderful. See, even after I finish this video, I'm going to be thinking about this boot on this guy's back. I'm be like, I can't wait to draw somebody with a boot on his back because that is so cool to me. I didn't know you could do that. I was like, wow, okay, that is wonderful. That is wonderful. It really makes me appreciate this, and I appreciate you for being here, watching me live. Part of the reason why I do these live streams is because it gives me an excuse to draw and stare at beautiful paintings. I appreciate you being here. The more I look at this is essentially two values. Well, it's got three, but it's basically gray and black, basically. So so gray. Gosh, even the gray is quite. This gray makes me sad. That's the one thing I don't like about this. I don't like gray skies. I'm a sunny, hot weather beach guy. If I'm at the beach, I want to see clear skies. Sunny and clear skies. I'm sure you can relate. But so powerful. Just how he could do so much with just gray and black. It's incredible. Incredible. It's so sophisticated. At first glance, right? At first glance, an artist or an art student will look at this and go, "Oh my God, look at those beautiful figures. Oh, look at that beautiful fabric. Oh, look at that beautiful face. Look at that head drawing. Oh, look at the beautiful wrinkles and folds. Oh, look at the dynamic pose. Oh, hand. Oh. Right? They'll look at the details, which are absolutely stunning, well executed details. The trained eye, the trained eye will go, "Oh my God, look at that beautiful grouped abstract blob of black. Look at that giant mass of gray. What is going on?" When I look at this, I just see big blobs of black on a big gray surface. That is part of the psychological read. Dark patterns on a dark gray world kind of, adds to the somber mood, somber feeling. It kind of, so it's not quite sad, but it's not quite happy either. Okay, so I think that's a good. Let me smudge around some dark gray gradients, and I think that'll be a good stopping point. So now I'm just going to take some gray tone and just kind of apply it in the sky anyway, and on him. It's great. It'll probably be a little bit darker. Still kind of sells the story. I think overall the gray is a little too bright. Let me go ahead and wash a gray. Oh yeah, that's much more moody, much more somber. So gray. Right here, a little bit in this guy. Even more fun in my sketchbook, but those videos. So anyway, that's essentially what I'm after here. His face is much darker, too sophisticated, and we're at a good stopping point now. You can see the powerful placement of the figures really tells the story, and of course the various their poses and the use of simple values, particularly dark black ends this sort of muddy, moody gray. Creates really heightens the feeling of the story, and now we can put all of these elements into our own work. So I look forward to seeing some drawings and compositions from you of people bowing or people being stepped on the back or figures up high, figures down in the corner. So wonderful lessons we learned from Howard Pyle here.